Okay? I think we'll start. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for coming along. Way bigger audience than I thought at 5 o'clock on the first day. I'm going to be determined to finish dead on time, if not before, because I'm sure everyone's got other things to do. There's a lot to cover. I'll try and zip through it, and I will definitely try and allow time at the end for questions for Q&A. If you don't get a chance to answer questions, I'll definitely stick around as well. Please come and ask stuff. I'll be delighted to have a conversation with you. So my name's Harvey Wheaton. I'm currently the VP of Operations at Natural Motion, which covers production, a load of business operations, a whole ton of stuff. We're part of the Zynga family, so we make mobile games free-to-play, CSR2, Dawn of Titans, and now some Star Wars games based in London, and with Boss Alien in Brighton as well. So there's a lot going on in our world. When I first put this idea of a presentation together, this is what I titled it. This is about 6 months ago. It's a really rubbish title, which is why I'm even more surprised there's people here to listen to this. I kind of retitled it when I was creating this. There's a macro theme that runs through this whole presentation, which is a kind of proposed fifth agile value, which I know is very cheeky and presumptuous, but I'd like to talk about that. There's a lot of stuff in here about velocity and story points. So apologies to people that aren't that up to speed with Scrum, with Agile. This is not a refresher. This is kind of going to dig into some detail, actually, and give you a case study. So there's a bit of preamble, a bit of chat, and then a couple of projects of case study that hopefully will be really interesting to you. So first thing I always say in these things, if you're in the wrong room, or that sounds really boring, please go. You have total permission. I won't be offended. So please, at any point, actually. So this is me. I'm not going to bore you with the details. I've been doing software development for a very, very, very long time. Games since around about 2003 when I joined EA. The first part of my career was extraordinarily waterfall project management. In fact, I was a developer. I sat in a porter cabin in the back of a manufacturing company at ICI, writing specifications in design documents for 18 months before we were allowed to touch any code, which at the time seemed kind of normal. It was okay. That's just what we did. And what this is really about is, I guess, my journey partly through understanding Scrum and Agile, which has taken an awfully long time, and I'm still not there. So apologies for anyone who's starting out on the journey. It's pretty tortuous. I got my certified Scrum Master with Mike Cohn in 2007, and my certified Scrum Professional in 2009. So it's a long time and a lot of mistakes. I'm either a very, very slow learner, or this is very difficult, I suspect. This is the best diagram I could come up with late last night to sort of explain my kind of Scrum experience. From a waterfall environment, coming into EA, absolute chaos. I had no idea what was going on with these projects and how we were working, so I've tried to, very messy. We kind of discovered Scrum and had an attempt at implementing it with some pretty nasty mistakes in there. At Supermassive Games, we did a good implementation, I think, for a while, kind of fell apart as the studio grew, and we got into some very, very complicated, bigger team projects. Spent a lot of time as a coach and trainer, very fortunate to work with a lot of games companies around the world where we sort of refine the idea. And at Natural Motion, I've been very fortunate to be able to put some of that learning really into practice as a bit of an experiment, really. So that's kind of where this story starts. I joined Natural Motion to do a cross-studio role, looking after all production, trying to improve our processes, and also work on some studio operational things. What actually happened is 3 months in, we weren't able to hire for the head of production, the executive producer role, as we call it, on CSR2, one of our flagship products. And I was asked if I would step in to run the production for that title for a while, which turned into about 1.5 years in the end. But it was a fantastic opportunity for me to get to grips with mobile games, with the team, to understand the company and what was going on. When I joined the team, there were quite a lot of issues. I mean, there's still issues. We all have issues every day. But in terms of predictable, on-time and quality releases going out in quite a regular cadence, so at least every couple of months, if not every 6 weeks, a release was going out. We were missing them. They were not always bug-free. Lots of problems going on. So one of my first starts, just out of interest, this all sounds very esoteric, but we sort of just wanted to set something that said, here's where we want to be as production. We kind of want to be the best. And I know that sort of vision statements are sometimes not particularly meaningful, but I wanted to at least put a stake in the ground about what we were doing. And what I'm going to talk about today is what the real focus of this was, which was getting to predictably release high-quality software. on time. That's really what the main focus was initially. Underneath that, there was a whole plan. And part of that plan, a big part of that plan, was a real back-to-basics approach with Scrum and Agile. Something I've struggled with, like you saw in my curly diagram. It is very difficult, but we thought perfect opportunity to hear on a moderately small team, in terms of each individual feature team, to really get this right. So a real back-to-basics approach. What that really meant for the team were these things, initially. An absolute focus on the product backlog. For those of you, how many people have done Certified Scrum Master or training? People done that? Yeah. One of the things I find, it depends on the trainer, but I think there is nowhere near enough focus on getting the product backlog right in Scrum. I think with Scrum, there's a lot of focus on the ceremonies, on the sprint cadence, on the reviews, on the stand-ups, on the roles, all very, very important. But actually, without a really good product backlog, products just don't go anywhere, and we don't get the optimal use of Agile and Scrum that we're really looking for. There was some stuff around roadmap release planning, really big focus on done, which I'm not going to cover today. That's a whole other talk, I think, for people that have sort of seen that statement. I'm sure people trying to use Scrum come across what does done mean frequently. We still do. Scrum fundamentals and a lot of reorg around the roles. But for today, I'm going to talk about product backlog and some of those Scrum fundamentals, and I will get to the case studies in a second that explains what we did and how that worked for us. Before that, one of the things I found through frequent training sessions that I run is that we really, really need to go back to the Agile manifesto before we get into the Scrum kind of rhythm of things. I suspect there's a lot of people in the room that have read this, seen it, but too often I think it just sort of kind of goes over our heads. It's words that sound sensible, sounds pretty good. But I was sort of actually counted up the words on this, not exactly, but last night. There's only 50, 60 words on this. And what I've realized over time is that with that few words, and I don't know, maybe another couple of hundred in the 12 principles as well, every word means something. Every word counts. They've been chosen very, very carefully. And some statements sound similar, but are actually quite different. Some support each other. So when we talk about Agile, another frustration I think in the world is that everybody wants to be Agile. There are so many flavors of it. We use Scrum, we use different methodologies. It's quite cool and trendy to be Agile. To some people it means just get stuff done. We're Agile, come on, just do it, just do it. Actually, it's a very disciplined sort of framework. And the Agile manifesto doesn't tell us how to do anything. It really tells us how to be. And before we can really implement Scrum well, in my opinion, we have to really understand these values. And so my cheeky fifth value that I've come to really trumpet and sort of talk to the teams about whenever I'm working with them is this one. And that in an Agile development world, we value output over work. Now, it's kind of implied by working software over comprehensive documentation. It's also kind of implied by one of the 12 principles, which states that working software is the primary measure of progress, which again, we may just gloss over our heads. But I think once you get that actually what we're really trying to get to is completed software every sprint in the Scrum framework, completed software, the focus is on that output, the product backlog focuses on output, our measure of progress focuses on output. So now whenever I come across a product backlog that is full of lists of work and tasks and things to do, it's a task list, that's not a product backlog. It should describe what we're expecting to see in the finished software. Which to some of you may be, yeah, of course, that's what we do. To others, I find it's very confusing. So here's some of our Scrum basics. Product backlog was absolutely essential. We've chosen the user story approach. It was fairly well accepted. Like a lot of studios, I guess, we were kind of doing Agile and kind of doing Scrum. You know, there's a lot of those sort of things were going on with stand-ups and sprints. We didn't really have a product backlog that people understood with user stories, good acceptance criteria describing what it means in the working software to be finished at the end of every sprint. And we certainly didn't have a good notion of the size of those items in the product backlog, which, as you'll see in the case studies, is essential to be able to track progress and forecast forward for predictability. Really sort of re-establishing the weekly sprint rhythm, the planning, the reviews, the retrospectives, and what I'm going to talk a lot about today is measuring and using velocity. So just before I get into the case study, just talk about our backlog, or our backlogs actually. This is kind of the textbook view of a product backlog. I'm sure many of you have seen this already. Big things at the bottom that are far out, smaller things at the top that we're going to start working on are well enough defined to take into a sprint and actually start working on. In our case, over time, the way that we organized this was actually into at least 2 backlogs. We maintain a product backlog for CSR2, for example, that is the big features, the roadmap that the product managers and the designers want to see go into the game, really big epics, if not bigger than epics. Icelandic sagas, as a friend of mine once coined them, so really big things. And that's what forms our roadmap. And we estimate those more as a capacity planning exercise. Based on this feature, this one seems like about the same size, so it's probably a team for 6 months. Really crude estimation at the roadmap level. When we're ready to start working on something, it comes out of that backlog and turns into a feature backlog in its own right, at which point it gets broken down into user stories. In our case, the process is that the product owners, which is typically a designer in this case, actually write a specification first. So I guess that's quite old-fashioned and not particularly agile, but we write a feature specification, and then we turn that into user stories, which probably a topic of another talk is what a skill and an art it is to actually write good user stories. We had a particularly good designer on these projects that could do that. So now what we have is a feature backlog with well-described user stories that says, here's what we want to actually create at the end of each sprint and by the end of the project. We use story points for estimating those user stories. I have fallen in love, out of love, hated, loathed story points through the sort of 12, 14 years I've been using Agile, and I'd completely misunderstood them for a long time. I passionately believe that they're a fantastic tool now for predicting, and I'll show you why, but they are extraordinarily difficult to bed in with a team and for people to truly understand. Because they're this sort of esoteric, magical gut feel mix of how big is this user story to turn it into a piece of working software, taking into account the amount of effort for the team, not an individual, for the amount of effort for the team, the complexity, the unknowns, the risk, just what's the sort of size of this thing. It's very intuitive. It's not desperately scientific, but it is takes into account all those factors. And those are the factors that added together give us a number of story points for this thing that we're trying to estimate. And they're also another way that it helps us focus on the output, not on the work, because we're sizing the thing that says, what's it going to take to complete this piece of working software in the game for all of us as a team? It's not a measure of, it's not trying to substitute task estimates in hours and days for the work we have to do. This is trying to size the piece of software we're trying to create by the end of it all. So I'm going to do a little interactive exercise, which is difficult in a room this size. I don't know if you've come across this before. This is the best way I've found of illustrating story points for people that don't understand them, haven't used them, or tried and struggled. If people really get it and understand it, then fine, you can sit this one out. So I've got a map here. Because story points are used and sized, every story is sized relative to every other story. You have to start somewhere. You have to have a baseline because it's a relative estimating technique. So in this example, I've got some journeys here, some road journeys. And I have arbitrarily said London to Oxford. I don't know, has this got a pointer on it? London to Oxford is so as a traveller, I want to get from London to Oxford. It's a 2-point story. So I'm giving you that for free. On that basis, does anybody want to hazard a guess as to what the London to Brighton journey would be sized as? 2? Any advance on 2? 1.7. Wow, that's very accurate. Has anybody done both of those journeys and got some knowledge about that? Do you want to talk about it? Is there anything that might affect the judgment of the size? Time of day, traffic. Does either of them suffer more variability than the other on that front? Brighton. So there's a bit of risk in that based on the fact that depending on when we go in the traffic, that might up it to a 3 potentially. These are the sort of discussions we have in our user story sizing exercises. And asking people if they've ever done this before is actually a really good question. Has anyone done this before? No idea. Okay, we should probably allow something for risk if we haven't done this before. So I'm going to step into Scrum Master and go, we'll give that a 3. And that's a 2. What about this wiggly Oxford to Exeter route? What do we think? If you can't remember the scale, by the way, there's the scale. The scale's like this for a reason, which again, I'm not going to cover in the topic, but I've learned slowly over the last few years that the scale's there for a very, very definite reason. But based on that scale, who's going to stick their neck out? 5. So if that's the case, it's 2.5 times the size of our London to Oxford journey. Is that happy with that? Is that okay? There's no right or wrong, by the way, just 2.5 times? 8? 4 times? 4 times? More variables. Has anyone done this before, that journey? There's quite a lot of different routes you can take, actually, I think, in that one. So you get the point. I'm not going to keep going on to this, but we can start to weigh in risk, complexity, type of roads, traffic, etc. It's interesting we assumed we were driving. I mean, what if we were flying? What if we were walking, cycling, space hopping? I don't know. We could be doing anything. And the really, really cheesy analogy of the mode of transport is, provided we use our same method of transport, the same technology, the same team to get there, then if we undertake the first journey that was a 2-pointer and it takes us 2 hours, we should roughly expect that a 4-point journey takes us twice as long, roughly. But that relative distance, or the story points we gave at the start of that, tells us nothing about how long it's going to take to do that journey. We only talked about relative distances. Luckily, for me, nobody mentioned time in that whole thing. So story points are independent of time when we're estimating, but they become related to time once we start to measure how fast we get through them. So with those story points estimated, I'm going to do my first journey and go, oh, okay, my sprint is a day. I can get through several of those journeys in a day, and that's how story points kind of work. I hope that makes sense and doesn't confuse things more. Velocity is simply the number of story points that a team completes within a sprint, within a fixed period of time, which in our case is a 2-week period. That's our sprint length, is 2 weeks, which I think is pretty standard for most people. And the velocity is actually measuring, when done well, the rate of completion of working software, the output. It's not measuring how many tasks we did. One of my horrible mistakes early on in one company I worked with was we had the physical boards with the Post-its for all the tasks, estimated in days, hours, whatever it was. And for some reason, I thought a good measure of progress was to buy a big Perspex bin. And whenever we took a task off the board, we scrumpled it up and put it in the bin and kind of measured progress as the bin filled up. And it's like, wow, we did a load of work. Where's the software? Well, we haven't looked at it for a few weeks. And that sounds very naive. But this is what velocity is. It's measuring the rate of completion of working software. So hopefully now you have some of those concepts in your heads. Let's talk about a couple of case studies. Here's the first one. So within CSR2, we've got this huge roadmap of features. Here's one we wanted to do. It was an extension of the single-player campaign to take us through a whole new series of challenges once you've completed the first 2. Simple as that, really. It was a relatively known feature set. We had 2 single-player campaigns that were broadly similar, so we kind of knew roughly what we were letting ourselves in for. We'd guessed it was about 2 months. We had around about, I went back and counted, we had around about 20 user stories at the start, so not particularly big. We thought it'd be 3, 4, 5 sprints maybe. Core team of 6 to 8, but a lot of supporting people providing artwork, the cars, and some of the network engineering actually as well. But we didn't have any velocity data. So we were starting blind. So we kind of guessed. We set ourselves a guess. And here's kind of how it played out. So this is, we used, not Excel, actually Google Sheets. We use Google Sheets. I love Google Sheets, by the way. If you want to do a training session on that, it's the most amazing thing. We chose the spreadsheet actually for complete flexibility. So we use Jira, we use all sorts of tools. But I find they sort of tie you into doing things in a particular way. And we wanted to experiment, so this was a very free way of doing things. So we set up this. The backlog underneath this data is extraordinarily simple. It's a list of user stories, each with acceptance criteria, each with a date that they were added to the backlog, each with a size in story points, and each with a date that they were completed. That's it. From that, we derive everything else you're going to see today. So here's Sprint Zero. We run a Sprint Zero. I know that's contentious for some people in the Scrum world, but that's us basically creating our initial product backlog. What are we actually going to make here? And that's our initial user stories, sized in this case at, you probably can't read that, 64.5 points was our initial backlog. So that's Sprint Zero. Orange is added. Sprint 1. Completed quite a good amount of stuff, the green. The light green is completed but got added inside the sprint. So we tracked what got added during the sprint, and our backlog kind of went up a bit. Okay. Sprint 3, similar pattern. We completed a load of stuff. We added more stuff and completed it in this case. And then by the end of the project, this is kind of how it ended up. So it was actually a relatively short project, but you can see we started by sprint 3 to add stuff that we didn't complete in the sprint. There's a theme here. The backlog's growing. And we know backlogs grow, they just do. The backlog in this case did not grow because we re-estimated story points. I very, very rarely on the teams re-estimate story points. And a little thing that I certainly stick to is if we start with a story that's, say, 20 points and we split it up into smaller stories, we make sure that the total adds up to 20 points. Always I'm splitting stories into the same size as the big thing. Otherwise you get this big sort of popcorn explosion of points and the velocity just gets bigger, but the points get bigger. It all just gets a bit meaningless. So here's where we ended up. Here's our velocity. So we were tracking and measuring our velocity. What did we actually complete every sprint? I think we guessed at around about 30, and we ended up with an average of just about 30, 29.5 across that project. One lesson, which you'll see at the end here, is that actually tracking stuff for us, just starting to measure things, was so valuable when we got to the end of the project. We were so glad we started measuring stuff because it gave us some data to base our next project on. The backlog grew. It really did grow by quite a lot. Backlogs just always do. I think on anything but the simplest project you're completely sure of, it grows. You forget things, you uncover new requirements, you start playtesting and realize you've forgotten stuff or missed stuff or need new stuff. The backlog just grows all the time. Our average velocity we got from that project was about 30 story points per sprint. Surprisingly, our management, all the way to the top of Zynga actually, were very happy with us reporting in this way. I thought that was going to be quite a battle. In some other companies I've seen that, they want to schedule and milestones and roadmaps and all that kind of stuff. But exactly those charts are what went into the regular reporting, both to our own management and right to the top of the CEO actually in Zynga. They were surprisingly all right with that. And we definitely found we needed to factor in time for this iteration and polish that we have to do. And I think that is partly just games development. Once we've got stuff together, however finished we think it is, and we put it in front of other people, we generate more stuff to do. So we have to factor that in somewhere. It feels quite anti-Scrum. We're supposed to finish things in a sprint, but actually, rarely until you put it in front of somebody is it going to be finished. So then we took that data into our next project, CSR2 Legends, much bigger project. For people that played CSR Classics, it was kind of like a game inside a game to bring back this whole new restoration of old cars into the game, and it was a huge amount of work, much more complex. Around about a 10-month project. Same team, which is great because we could take the learning. We had some additions and people came and left, but broadly speaking, it was the same team. Round about 60. Oh, the previous one, by the way, we started with 20. We ended up with about 30 user stories. This one we started with 60, ended up with close to 100 by the end of the project. And in January 2019, we had a committed live date of 21st of November 2019. That we kind of, like those business things, you have to hit that. That's a massive date. If we miss that, we miss Thanksgiving. We miss the US market, we're in January. We have to do that. So there's a lot of pressure to hit that date. So we took the data from the previous project and we applied it to this and we went, okay, we're reckoning on about 30 points per sprint. Here's our initial backlog, 244 points. So it's a lot bigger, but same principles applied. One difference was, because this was a much bigger, more complicated project, we did split it up into milestones. And we had a number of sprints from memory. I think it was 3 sprints plus a hardening sprint, which again, we can talk about separately as to whether that's good or bad. It basically means we weren't really done inside the sprints and we needed to kind of get things finished off at the end of each one before we could then do a play test and really gather the feedback on where we'd got to. This chart is actually the chart at the end of the project. I couldn't recreate the one from the beginning, unfortunately. We spent a lot of time at the start of this project balancing our user stories and our number of story points across each milestone. And that led to some great discussions about what's the real core focus of the first milestone? What's the real focus on the output of the second milestone? So by looking at the user stories, trying to balance the points across the capacity we thought we had great conversations about the structure of the project and what we would have at each stage. So that was a really good little innovation. And here's how it ended up. So I'm not going to step you through every one. This chart looks a lot more horribly complicated, but it's the same data, exactly the same data. You can see how the backlog's grown. You can see the orange where we've added stuff, the light green where we've added it but done it. We've got some kind of trend and tracking information here. You can see the purple line showing how the backlog grew. The orange and red lines we added a little bit later on in the project, they represent the capacity the team had at the third and fourth milestones. And our initial intent was to keep milestone 4 free of backlog items so that we had time to iterate and polish stuff. In fact, the backlog grew quite significantly during that time. So the project didn't play out as perfectly as you might think. We got it shipped exactly on the date we said we would. On the 21st of November, it went live. But what this allowed us to do, this kind of tool, allowed us to monitor progress as we went and make decisions as we went on, do we have to not do some user stories? Do they go into version 2? Is the data in jeopardy? And in fact, one of the other interesting bits of tracking things, apart from the velocity, which again is another story, by the way, this velocity chart is horrible. Velocity was all over the place. And I think it was probably about the understanding of done as we went through this, probably. By either amazing management or complete luck, our average velocity was pretty much dead on the 30 we thought it was going to be, which helped a lot. We kept a close eye on that. And here's another chart that I created from that very same data. It's all the same data, where we forecast forward that based on our velocity with the backlog remaining, when are we going to get this done? And that gave us a chart here which shows us at the end of every sprint where we think the end date's going to be. And I watched that kind of like a hawk at the end of each sprint. I don't know what happened at the end of sprint 3. I think it may be an error in the data. It went a bit wonky. But that was really useful. So certainly backlog grew, 65%. We certainly need to allow even more time, the more complex the project is, for this play testing, iteration and feedback. We certainly need to be better understanding done in every sprint, which I think is another topic in its own right. We had a really strong Scrum Master that kept things on track, was determined to make sure at the end of every sprint, we had a review with working software on device where we demonstrated the stories and got people involved to give us feedback. The other thing I noted is that, I think this happens to all projects, you see it doesn't complete at the end here by sprint 11. The process kind of falls apart when you've got an alpha-ish kind of build of the software we've found. You go into a very different mode where you've really got a list that you're daily going into and fixing and refining and sorting out feedback much more dynamically. So on all projects, it kind of fell apart. I found this actually when I was doing some training a few months ago, which I really love as a cartoon, just to talk about done, which I say is maybe a little bit of an advert for another session I'll maybe put together at some point in time. The problem with not being done. So here's a project team that've gone, wow, we've tripled our story points per sprint because they put everything in almost done. Sounds good, yeah, we've done, and that's what we do actually. We maybe not as obvious as that, but we kind of get things working and then assume that we're nearly finished. And the danger with this is that we actually don't know how much time and effort there's going to be to get things truly finished, which is why it's so important to make sure we actually understand what we mean by done. And we have tried different approaches like iteration stages for done. You know, we have a draft, we have a second pass, an alpha, a functional, or whatever you want to call it, and we define those. If we're doing that, my note of caution would be that it generally takes longer and longer to finish things, not shorter and shorter a time to finish things. It's quite easy to knock up a quick thing that's working, but to actually finish it takes a lot of time. And that's the danger with not actually getting done. Based on all that, we derived as like a very basic sort of planning model for all new projects now, where we just take all that stuff into account. We go, here's the backlog size at the start, here's the sprint length, how much is it going to grow by, do we think? And it just says, okay, here's where your real date will fall. Almost there, by the way, now, in case you're wondering. For people who haven't read Waltzing with Bears as a book on risk, phenomenal book on risk. And what this model kind of gives us is, if you look at the initial backlog we created in each project, and you simply took the velocity and went, oh, we'll be done by this date, that in the book is referred to as the nano% chance of getting it done. It's like the absolute theoretical earliest. We know backlogs grow, we know other things happen. So when we factor in some backlog growth and also time to iterate and polish, we end up with a project that's 70% longer at least than we thought. Which actually, if people have ever seen the cone of uncertainty, it sort of rings true to me. I went back and looked at this again last night. By the time we've got our sort of, this is old-fashioned terminology, but by the time we've got our requirements complete, we've got our user stories and our first backlog, then we're probably at the 1.25 to 1.5 times variability in our actual end date delivery. It's just what happens because we're not actually completely there. We don't have the details. We haven't got the game to play. So, final bit before questions. Some of the top tips for me were focus on the output more than the work. It's about the playable software we deliver at the end of each sprint, as described by user stories, and understanding what it actually means to have that finished. And acceptance criteria, for example, are amazing at helping teams think about that. Get the product backlog in good shape. Get it in good order. The user stories, those criteria, and size it. Unless you have a backlog that is sized, you can't possibly predict forward to when the project's going to end. You're just doing stuff, and it may be good stuff. And if that's okay, that's okay. But if an end date is important, you need to track this stuff. So start measuring. The velocity, how quickly is the team completing finished software, the story points. How much is the backlog growing? And based on that, what are we able to forecast forward based on our velocity? It takes 2 or 3 sprints at least to kind of calibrate this stuff, but it's incredibly powerful. And actually reporting using backlog and velocity, I found, is both simple, powerful, and it's fairly objective. This is the size of what we've got left to do. This is how fast we're getting through it. That's when we're going to complete. And as project managers, let alone Scrum Master, I think that's our job, is to report the status, to give everyone perspective on here's where we are, to drive really good decision making about what we do next. And underneath it all, get the Scrum basics right. Underneath that, understand why we do any of this from an agile point of view, from the manifesto's point of view. And that, 2 minutes over my first part. Planning for half an hour with around about 15 minutes of questions. So it's quite dense in there, and some good thoughts, I hope, for people. I'm happy to take any questions. Happy for you to leave if you'd like to leave. Anybody have any questions? Yeah.
What are your thoughts on...
Oh.
Thank you. What are your thoughts on projecting points per department rather than per team? So, like, for example, to be able to do capacity planning for your 3D artists versus your coders and not mixing those velocities?
I personally think it's meaningless, that it's not what points are for. If that department, whatever they mean, are single-handedly creating finished software, I think that makes sense. But typically it's a team effort to create that when finished software, because it's engineering, design, art. Everywhere you look at stuff that has to go in. They are a measure of team effort of completion of finished software. So to talk about the velocity of the engineers, to talk about the velocities of Harvey, to talk about the velocity of how do we improve Harvey's velocity, is just a complete misunderstanding of, I think, of what they're really about. So I don't recommend that. But I need to know the circumstances exactly.
When you mentioned that you use Google Docs for your Scrum
yeah.
planning, I did try doing that and built something and had a way to print it out on paper as well from
Yep.
that. But I was wondering, are you using that as your entire system, or are you using Google Docs to make data that goes into, say, Jira or something like that? Great question. And if so, also, is there anything you could show that just what that kind of looks like?
There's nothing I can show because I was asked by legal to remove all actual backlogs from this. Oh, sorry, is that on video? So I'll tell you what we do. So we maintain our feature backlog on that spreadsheet. I mean, it could be in any tool, but that's the thing that's giving us this data. That's what I'm using to track the project progress and the forecast forward. Then what we do is every sprint, when we've agreed on what the user stories are we're going to deliver, the spreadsheet just formats them and we print them out and literally physically cut them up and put them on a board. And the user stories go on a physical board that we get together in the daily stand-ups every day. We do not anymore put tasks on our board, on our physical board. I found it's such an overhead and for no benefit. Teams are self-organizing. It's up to them how they want to organize their work and manage it. We focus on the user stories only in the stand-up and go, is this story on track? If not, what are we going to do about it? And in fact, if I could rewrite, I'm going to be very presumptuous now, if I could rewrite the 3 questions in the stand-up from what did you do yesterday, what are you doing today, what are your blockers, I would be asking, for this user story, are you confident we'll have it delivered by the end of the sprint? Yes, great. Not, okay, what are we going to do? So we do that on the physical boards. Some teams choose to recreate that physical board in Jira or another tool, and they add all of their detailed tasks, even with estimates sometimes, that they can then use as their task list. But I kind of leave that up to them. That's entirely up to them.
So if you're not putting them on the physical board, where are you?
Which?
If you're not putting the cutout stories.
Yeah, we are. The stories go on a physical board.
They are?
Yeah. the stories only, not all the task stuff, just the physical. So we actually got 3 versions. We got the backlog with the user stories, printed cards on a wall people talk about every day, and potentially a Jira board, which only exists so that developers can add tasks to it so they can track their work every day. That's how we do it on most teams. Sorry, there was another one that I heard.
Yes. So my question is, like you mentioned that you have a product backlog which is at an epic level, and from there you pick items which go into your feature backlog.
Yeah.
What I wanted to understand is, like, who all is involved in these 2 backlog stages? Like, where do you get the entire team involved, and where do you just keep it to the leads, and where do you just keep it to the product owner?
Yeah, that's... We find, again, thank you, you've just given me a topic of yet another presentation, which is product ownership in general.
This is a question we've been struggling with, that's why I'm asking you.
It's a nightmare, and again, for some reason I think in video games development it's like a double nightmare. It's so difficult, because everybody thinks they're a product owner. Everyone's got an opinion. Everyone thinks they know what we should be doing. So we haven't solved it, but what we do is generally, what I have observed actually in any company is that from the CEO and the COO downwards to the smallest of teams, there is a great partnership when things work well between the person who's saying what we're going to do and the person who's getting it done and making sure how we get that done, which is kind of product owner and scrum master. So that is absolutely essential. Our product ownership is kind of a hierarchy through the organization. It's a little bit loose. It starts with the head of, we call it the GM, but some people would call it the EP. It's the head of that particular, who's owning that game from a P&L point of view. They're kind of setting the broad direction, and then things get handed down. So the product roadmap with those big epics in belongs to, the lead designer and maybe the lead PM together is what we found actually generally works quite well in a live title. It might be a designer or creative director in other organizations. And then each of those epics is handed, typically in our case, to a designer, again paired up with a product manager, to break it down to the user stories, own that, and then work with the teams every day on the detail. So if you do that, one of the challenges we've found is how do you make sure that what you're doing, that the stakeholders further up the chain are as involved as they can be in what's going on down here. But that's how we do it. We have kind of a delegated set of product ownership, if you like, through the teams. It's difficult. Any more? One more. Oh, 2 more. Oh, you need to... Oh, one there. And I promised to finish on time, so...
I know you said that you weren't going to do too much on the definition of done, but I have a burning question about what you consider to be the definition of done for artwork. Because that, for me, has been a really difficult topic.
Well, you're asking a non-artist, so, I mean, it's never done, is it? I don't think. That's half the problem. It's really tricky. That was on both projects we found, particularly in our case, for the UI stuff, actually. Actually, there's 2 different approaches. On the UI stuff, generally, we had a sort of a very iterative approach. The first version of Done was very much, we've got wireframes and placeholder stuff in. Then we had something that at least looked like it was supposed to, and then we had the finished version. So I think the trick for us going forward is to keep that. I'm happy with that approach, provided we can say, if to get it truly finished at shippable, it's 10 points, what number of points is in each of those stages? And my guess is it's 2, 4, whatever the other one is. I think it just gets incremental. With the cars development, that was a very different story because we had a very experienced team who were used to creating finished things, perfect recreations based on CAD and all the rest of it. And one of the things that actually did cause some issues occasionally for the team was those cars got delivered kind of just in time, completely done. They were absolutely finished and done. But obviously, the minute you integrate the artwork into the game, you do find some unexpected problems and issues. So there were 2 approaches. One was just to get it absolutely finished and then integrate it. Another was, which I prefer personally, was integrate it in as early as you can, however basic it is, and then iterate on it in the game. And those are the sort of things that generate some of the backlog growth. It's like, we didn't expect that to be looking like that when we actually see it. I don't know if that answers the question, but that's probably the best I can think today. There was one down here, I think. Oh, you.
Hi, I know you work with perfect teams, Harvey. When in a situation where dev teams have got the sprints working, the agile, the forecasting, and it's at the top level a fixed deadline project,
yep.
That seems a fundamental clash that I still see occurring in more than 50% of projects.
Yeah, I nearly put the very basics. Some problems, when I start doing any of the training sessions, I always start by saying that some problems in our project are not Agile or Scrum problems. They're just problems. And there's no magic answer in Scrum or Agile to doing too much work in too little time with too few people. It doesn't solve it. It's just a problem. So the sort of the eternal triangle to me is time, the scope, the budget, which is usually our team size, to be honest, on our teams generally, unless we're outsourcing stuff. And in the middle of all those three is the quality that we're trying to get to. And so I think we'll recognize, we've all seen this, that when we squeeze or fix the time, the scope and the budget, the only thing that's going to suffer is the quality. We end up with too many bugs at the end, the product ships before we're ready. So back to what I said, I think halfway through the presentation, I believe my job as a project manager is to provide that perspective to other people to say, on our current trajectory, based on objective data, here's what we've got left to do, here's how fast we're getting through it, what do you want to do? We can't magic up things that aren't going to be true. So it's not, and actually, that's one of the things about Scrum, that a lot of, maybe what you're hinting at, Ian, is that sometimes further up the chain, people just don't want to hear that. They want to see some amazingly fantastic, shiny, Gantt chart that shows we can do it in time. But actually what Scrum does is it really, really quickly, in fact, you should be prepared for this. Maybe some of you have seen it. It very quickly surfaces issues and problems for us to deal with. It doesn't solve them all, but it certainly gives them visibility. And that's what I love about it. One more, maybe, if there is one. Otherwise, we can... One more, and then we'll break.
Yeah, we run a live service game, and part of that is fixing bugs that crop up. How do you go about incorporating them into sprints and estimating them when...
Yeah, so many teams wrestle with this, whether it's bugs, support requests, stuff just happens. The way I've tried so many different ways. What we do now, generally, what I would advise people to do is, we don't size bugs in story points. What we do is we just track the number that we have and rely on our velocity data to show us how fast we can complete working software. Because there's so many other things go on in the world that prevent us from delivering the working software. Someone's ill, someone wasn't as good as we thought, there's tons of meetings in the way, we got bugs to fix, we got called into this whole marketing demo thing. And the great thing about taking that approach is, it just shows up in the velocity. And we go, well, at the moment, our velocity is 50 story points a sprint. It needs to be 70. How on earth do we get it to that point? Well, if we didn't have so many bugs to fix, that would help. So we count the amount of time that we spend on the bugs and go, as we're, because we're planning forward, don't forget, each sprint based on the velocity we had last time. So if on average, the team is spending a day a week fixing bugs, our velocity will be 4/5 of what it could be. So we count it and track it, but rely on the velocity to tell us the objective truth is, if we change nothing else, we will have this velocity forever. So it just makes it very visible. And then we've got a decision to make. What do we do? Do we just always have that velocity? Or do we tackle the bugs for a few weeks, then we get the velocity back up again, for example? Okay, we are dead on time. So thank you very, very, very much. And enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.